Good afternoon, fellow orchid lovers. It's Danielle here with a video about common orchid knowledge, possibly even myths, that I have ignored. It's a little bit of a cheeky title, but I feel that it's worth sharing this information. I've been watching a fair amount of YouTube content lately, and I feel like there are some things, even as a beginner myself, I've only been growing for a year, so I would still consider myself to be a beginner. But I know that there are things when I started a year ago that I believed were, the truth about orchids, or, well-known knowledge. And if you watch some of my earlier videos, some of the things I'm going to discuss right now, I even mentioned as, well, you should do this and you should do that. So really what this video is meant to do is to encourage people, instead of just watching other people's YouTube videos, do some research. Don't just take what people say on their videos as the truth about orchids, even if it's a method that works for them. I've said this a million times, your environment's going to be different where you are in comparison to them. Even the microclimates within your home or your grow space are going to be different than everybody else. So do your own research, watch your own plants, and don't take everything that is said as you need to be doing this. The first thing I'm going to start with is about unpotting orchids. So there's some people believe that you shouldn't unpot an orchid if it is in spike, if it is in bloom, or until there are new growths or new roots visible. And I don't follow that trail of thought. And the reason that I don't is because my experience, that hasn't been a problem. I have unpotted every single orchid almost the day I got it. And the reason for that is I find that most of the orchids that I get, even the ones from nurseries, the media is in a broken down state and the orchid is at risk of being compromised. The health of the orchid is at risk of being compromised because of that media. So to me, if it has a bloom spike or blooms, and me unpotting the orchid, makes that die or die back or shocks the orchid, it's better than losing the whole plant, which is very possible if you don't. For instance, a Phalaenopsis orchid, how long do their blooms last? Well, if you get an orchid that's, in bud, from the time that the buds are there to the time that the blooms start to fall, could be months. It could be 3 months. Now, if your orchid is potted in broken down acidic media and you wait 3 months to repot that orchid, what might happen to that orchid? It could die. So not only will you lose the blooms, you're going to lose the entire plant. So in my mind, the plant itself is more important than whether or not the blooms last. That being said, as long as you're gentle and careful when you're unpotting the orchid, there's no reason why the blooms should fail. This is one of my new orchids. We had a little bit of a problem with her because her roots weren't very healthy, so her blooms looked like they were failing, but it wasn't because I unpotted her, it was because her roots were in bad shape. I figured out what was going on. She has perked back up. New orchid. Unpotted her the first day I had her. I've had her for, I think 2 months now, almost 2 months. She still has her blooms. Another orchid I just got, about at the same time I got that other one, had her about 2 months. Do you see a problem with her blooms? Now this one was beat up as a bud, so it's not very pretty looking, but they're all healthy. Plant is healthy, no problems. 2 months later, would you say this orchid was unhappy about being unpotted? I wouldn't. This orchid, I've had this orchid probably about 6 to 8 months. Unpotted her as soon as I got her. What did she do? She extended her spike and she got more blooms, and now look at that. She's developing another bud. That mitten just won't go brown. It just keeps pushing out buds. So would you say she was unhappy with me unpotting her while she was in bloom? I wouldn't say that she is. I'd say that the opposite is true. So, you know, there are ways of unpotting orchids without stressing them or shocking them. If you take the plant and you turn it upside down and you shake it around and you rip all the media off of their roots and, you know, you're not gentle, yes, you could shock your plant, and yes, the blooms could drop, the spike could fail, the new growths might stall. But if you're careful with your plants and you don't get rough with them and you are, you know, gentle, there's no reason why you cannot unpot an orchid in spike, in bloom, or before the new growths appear or before the new roots appear. So those are all things that I don't listen to. There are some orchids that might be true with. I don't have those types of orchids. I have your basic types. I have Phalaenopsis, I have Cattleya, I have Branchostylus, I have Tolumnias, I have a few Dendrobiums. I don't have some of the more, you know, difficult orchids to grow. So there may be types outside of that range, you know, or certain species within these types that, you know, it's a well-known fact. You shouldn't repot them before the new growths or the new roots or anything like that. And that may be true. I don't have catasetums. I know catasetums are pretty fussy about what you do to them while they're resting. But chances are, if you have that kind of orchid, you're an experienced grower and you know what to do. But when you're talking about, you know, your basic Phalaenopsis, your basic Cattleyas, your basic, you know, plants that you're going to find as a beginner grower, I have never had a problem unpotting the orchid while it was in spike, while it was in bloom, or before the new roots or new growths have started. So that's one, I would say for me, myth that I don't listen to. The next one, this is a pretty big one. This is something that I, even in my beginning videos when I was talking about fertilizer, I said this. A lot of people say that they don't fertilize their orchids that are in bloom. And again, there may be certain types or certain species of orchids that you're not supposed to do that. I have no knowledge of those types, but your basic hybrids that you're going to get in your stores or your nurseries, that's not the case. Let's just break that down. Why is that the case? Well, if you think about it, there are orchids in nature. Is there someone in nature controlling when they get fed and when they don't get fed? Is there someone saying, oh, this orchid's in bloom, we can't let this orchid get fertilized today? No. If an orchid is in bloom, there is nothing in nature that controls whether it gets nutrients or not. So if it's the case in nature that they get fertilized no matter if they're in bloom or not, why would we think that we can't fertilize our plants that are in bloom? And I was a victim of this logic. I thought that that was the case. You know, I didn't know a whole lot about orchids when I first started growing. I knew I loved them. I've always loved orchids, but I really didn't know a whole lot about the way they grow and what makes them happy. And so, you know, like everyone else, I was watching YouTube videos and someone said, you're not supposed to fertilize your orchids when they're in bloom. And I just said, okay. And I just thought that was, you know, gospel. And I didn't fertilize my orchids when they were in bloom when I first started growing. And that's not true. Orchids in the wild get fertilized whether they're in bloom or not. When it rains, they get fertilized. When there's mist, they get fertilized. Nutrients trickle down to their roots. There's nothing that says, oh gosh, this one's in bloom, let's divert the nutrients. That doesn't happen. So why would we do it in our home? And then the other thing, people have a tendency not to want to fertilize their orchids in winter. And although, especially if you live in a colder climate, your orchid growth will slow down, orchids never stop growing. You know, again, I'm talking about the types of orchids that I have. So like, I don't have any knowledge of catasetum orchids. Maybe they do, in fact, completely go dormant and they don't grow at all. There's no root growth, there's nothing. That, you know, that might be an exception to what I'm saying. And there are some types of dendrobiums that are winter rest dendrobiums, and you don't give them nutrients in the winter. But I'm talking about, you know, just your regular run-of-the-mill Phalaenopsis, your regular run-of-the-mill Cattleyas, you know, just the plants that are outside that spectrum of winter rest plants. We can still feed them in the winter. Granted, you know, you don't have to be chucking nutrients at them because they're not growing at the same rate as they would in the summer, let's say, but they're still growing. My orchids have grown all throughout the winter. They've been getting new leaves, new roots, flower spikes have been developing. So if I wasn't giving this plant nutrients, how healthy do you think that flower spike would be? This orchid decided to rebloom in the winter. How much energy would it have had to push out those blooms? Same thing with this one. It extended its spike in the winter. So that's another myth that I don't follow. I do have a resting type dendrobium, and I don't give it nutrients in the winter. But outside the spectrum of that, your plants are continuing to grow throughout the year. Winter, sometimes if you live in a cold climate, things do slow down. You're going to see that things are going to slow down, but they still need nutrients. So, you know, don't completely stop giving them nutrients if they're continuing to grow. If you see a new leaf, or you see a new root, or you see your flower spike is still green and healthy, you know, give it something to eat. Don't starve it. Okay, so then the next one is, some people think that the only way to get an orchid to rebloom is to cut the flower spike immediately as soon as the blooms fall. And I mean, this orchid is a classic example of why that's not true. And I did believe that was true. I was of the thought process that as soon as the blooms fall off, you find the, you know, the nearest, the one node that's not, okay, butterfingers here, the one node that's not been used, and you cut it right there before that node and it'll rebloom. And that does work. I mean, this is an example of an orchid that I got this orchid in spike. When did I get this orchid? It was still cold, so I would say probably March of last year. And it came with a spike. It wasn't blooming. So she bloomed, the flowers fell off, and I cut it at this branch here. This branch came with her. Now, I did that because the tip of the flower spike started to turn brown and die back. So I cut it. This orchid, the tip of her flower spike never turned brown. That was the tip of her flower spike right there. Come on, focus. See that right there? That's where her flower spike ended. But it stayed green and healthy. So I left it alone, and look what happened. She's given me 5 more blooms, and now she's giving me a 6th. And that mitten is still healthy and green, so she could extend for quite some time. So if she starts to turn brown after these blooms have fallen, if this spike starts to turn brown and die, I will cut it at a node. But you don't always have to. If your tip of your flower spike is healthy, leave it alone, see what it does. This one, this plant, the tip of her flower spike is not healthy. I'm sorry, my camera's not really focusing. See that? It's all kind of like, it's still green, but it's a little shriveled. That's never going to extend. So when her flowers start to drop, I will cut her spike. I haven't checked this one. Let's see what this one looks like. Okay, so that one's healthy. So when the flowers start to fall on this, I'm going to leave this one alone, see what it does. It could extend off the end. So I don't subscribe to the belief that as soon as the blooms fall, you have to cut the spike. See what it does. It may extend for you. It may not, and it may start to turn brown, and you do have to cut it. But you could get more blooms off the tip of the spike, which in my mind, I think is even prettier. There's a beautiful cascade on that orchid. Okay, the next one is that the root without the velamen won't help your plant. I know that, you know, if you've been following me, you know that I am a big subscriber to the fact that you can take the velamen off of a root and use that to hydrate your plant. I recently watched a video where someone who has quite a few subscribers was asked this question, and she states that no, you can't do that. But then in the rest of her video, she states that you can. So it was a little confusing. So I just want to tell you my experience so that you can make your own conclusions. Because I have a fair amount of orchids that I've gotten that their roots have been absolute horrors, and I've saved the orchid with just the root with no velamen. So this is an example of an orchid that I've done that with. And another myth that I covered in my last video that I'm going to mention briefly right now is that you should use ice cubes. I went extensively into it in my last video, so I'm not going to go extensively into it in this video, but just so that you know, in case you haven't watched my last video, this is what ice cubes do to roots. They kill them. So don't do that. Okay, so the velamen. So as you can see here, this root, what color is that root? That's green. That root is still alive. So even though the velamen, has been removed, this root is still alive. It still has healthy velamen attached to it. Is it hydrating the plant as well as it could? No. A root without velamen is never going to hydrate the plant the way that a root with velamen is going to do it. I mean, it's like this for a reason, because the velamen helps keep the root, damp all the way up to the stem so that the hydration is reaching the plant. So it's not ideal. But if the velamen is rotting, if you just cut this root off, what does it have to hydrate itself? Nothing. The answer to that is nothing. Now, it's getting new roots, so very soon these roots are going to be not as important. But I've had this orchid for a year, and it's been in this state for about that amount of time, and it's still alive. It's gone through some shock, you can tell, because the leaves are smaller, and that's because it lost, a lot of its means of hydration. But the roots with the velamen, without the velamen, have hydrated the plant. This root is green. Now you'll see this one's not. So chances are this is a dead root that's not capable of sucking up water to the plant. However, that's not always necessary, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So this is my orchid that had no roots for quite a while. She's just starting to get her roots here. The only thing that I had to hydrate her were these strands of roots without the velamen. Are these alive? Probably not. There are a few that are slightly green that maybe are still alive, but most of them are brown, and if you are too rough with them, they do break off in your hand. However, this orchid has been alive and kept alive and been able to push out her new roots solely because these have been in the water. Now, if you know anything about water, water likes to travel. If it has contact with something, it likes to go, travel. So these roots, even though they're dead, they're damp all the way up to the stem. All the way up here, they're damp. So it is carrying water to the stem. Granted, it's a lot less, and the orchid shows that. This orchid is very dehydrated, but it's better than nothing. So take from that what you will. I've used this method, and it's worked. This plant is still alive. She's pushing out new roots. She'll be fine. In another couple of weeks, when these roots are long enough to go down into the water, this plant is going to bounce back, and she's going to be just fine. And the whole reason why that's the case is because I removed the rotten velamen from these roots, and I saved this orchid. This orchid I just showed you, these roots are still green. So removing the velamen that's rotting and leaving the velamen intact that's not will work. If the whole entire root is rotten, yeah, maybe this isn't sucking up the water, but the water is traveling up the root and saturating the root until it gets to the stem. And this stem is wet. I know you can't feel this, but this stem is damp. And it's all because these roots have brought the water up. It's not because it sucked the water up, but because water likes to travel and saturate things. And so therefore some hydration has been going up to the plant. And it's not great. I'm not going to tell you that this is, you know, amazing. But it's kept the plant alive, and that's my whole object. So it does work from my experience. You know, you can take from that what you will. And then the other thing I wanted to share with you is that you shouldn't get the rhizome or the stem wet. I did go over this briefly in my last video when I talked about saving orchids, but I just wanted to share it with you again. This orchid, you know, this is a cattleya, and common wisdom tells you you're not supposed to keep the rhizome wet, but I've literally had this rhizome in water for about a year now, and maybe a little less than a year, maybe like 10, 11 months, and it got a new growth because it had absolutely not a root on it, and it was going to die. So I said, you know what, let me just experiment, and I did, and look at that. So I'm not telling you to take your healthy cattleyas and keep their rhizomes wet. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is if you're trying to rescue an orchid, you can indeed keep, you know, wet the rhizome, and it could save that particular orchid. And then this orchid was in this state not that long ago. And now look at her, she's healthy. She's got a spike. And the way that I saved her, I didn't know about these strands when I got her. The way that I saved her is I would soak her stem. Not all day. I would just take the water and put it up to about here and soak her stem for 20 to 30 minutes at a time. Let it dry out. I would keep the water in the glass so she would have a hydration, but I would take it away from the stem after 20 to 30 minutes, let it dry out, do it again. And that worked for her. So just a few, you know, things that people might say that I've found are not necessarily true. And again, I'm not telling you that you need to do these things. The whole purpose of this video is just to say that you're going to hear a lot of stuff. You're going to hear a lot of content about what you should and shouldn't do. Don't just take that and think that that, again, is gospel, but, you know, it's the only way to grow your orchids. And do some research. I experimented, and I learned a lot. Like, again, this camera, man. There's nothing on the internet indicating you can do this. I experimented, and that's how I got this result. I have another orchid that the same thing, just this, and she's alive and healthy to this day because it does work. It's not the best thing in the world for your orchids, but if your orchid has no roots. So, you know, don't take everything that you hear, especially as a beginner, and just think that it's, you know, the way that things should be. Do some research. Go on, you know, some orchid boards. Check out videos from orchid growers that have been growing for a really long time. You know, still be careful with that, because the person that said that you can't use those strings was someone who has been growing for a really long time. Some people that have been growing for a really long time think that they know everything. And they don't necessarily experiment with something before they say whether it works or not. They kind of just give an answer without actual knowledge. And I've seen that a couple of times with this person. So, you know, be careful who you ask. There are other people that are very humble orchid growers that have been growing for years that are still learning, and they say they're still learning. They don't view themselves as authorities on orchids. Those are the kinds of people, you know, that you want to follow, the kind of people that are willing to share their mistakes, that are willing to entertain new ideas, even though they've been growing for years. So I hope that that was helpful to some people. It really has helped me. I feel that my blooms have lasted even longer because I stopped subscribing to the thought that you can't fertilize your orchids in bloom. And actually, I heard it on Roger's channel. When I first started growing, he was like, well, who in nature is making sure that the orchids in bloom aren't getting nutrients? And I was like, wow, duh, of course. That made so much sense. And I was like, why didn't I think of that? So, you know, it's just helpful sometimes to just put some thought into it, to go on people's channels that have been growing for a while and listen to their reasoning. But anyways, I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, let me know, and I will certainly talk to you all next time.